This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 337, entitled Monoconscious Feminists will be seen increasingly as bigots. Description. This flyer claims that as masculist ideas spread through Western countries and the hatred of young women towards the fluffy feminists grows, open bracket, who control the divorce courts, making divorce and hence marriage so toxic for men that 2/3 of young quality men refuse to give young women their sperm, close brackets. Monoconscious feminists, open brackets, who have only had their feminist consciousness raised and hence are unconscious of how women oppress men, and far worse than vice versa, close bracket, will be seen increasingly by society as being bigots. Once the proportion of feminists who become biconscious, that is, have had their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, becomes large enough, a tipping point will be reached when monoconscious feminists will convert themselves into biconscious feminists, who will then live happier lives once they lose their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness, which comes from seeing gender oppression as a one-way street, being ignorant of masculist ideas, which show that gender oppression is definitely a two-way street. The flyer itself. Bigger. Just a minute, I've got a big leaf in front of the screen instead of behind it. Just a minute. Monoconscious feminists will be seen increasingly as bigots, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer claims that as the core ideas of masculism spread throughout Western cultures, those feminists who remain monoconscious, that is, have had only their feminist consciousness raised, that is, are only aware of men's oppression of women, but not vice versa, will come to be seen as bigots by men, by masculists, by women, and even by feminists, that is, biconscious feminists, who have a very different view of the gender political world from the traditional monoconscious feminist. This flyer concentrates on the contrast between the mono and bi-conscious feminist, as seen by the masculists. A monoconscious feminist is anger-biased, gender-biased. For her, gender oppression is a one-way street, that is, oppression by men against women. A monoconscious feminist, by definition, has no awareness of how women oppress men, let alone being aware that women's oppression of men is far worse than vice versa, as almost inevitably is angry at men. When she hears masculists haranguing women, and particularly haranguing fluffy feminists, with all their hypocrisy in the divorce courts, her monoconscious feminist conditioning, in brackets, the masculists would say brainwashing, close bracket, causes her to interpret this masculist haranguing as yet another example of men's oppression of women. What the monoconscious feminist cannot do is put herself in the shoes of masculists and have an intuitive understanding of why the masculists are lashing out at the massive gender injustice committed by fluffy feminist hypocrites in the divorce courts, financially massacring and ruining the lives of one father in 4. The monoconscious feminist knows nothing about masculism, is not familiar with the long list of oppressions that women commit against men. For example, women's financial parasitism of men, women's manslavery, expecting men to work for women, the fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, where women hypocritically expect men to be cash machines to women, paying for them to have babies, but as fluffy feminists, they refuse to accept equal obligations with men by not bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college so that women can pull their financial weight as adults and not expect, fluffy style, to live off the labour of a man. The Masculists despise fluffy feminist hypocrites for pushing for equal rights with men in the parliaments, but behaving as fluffy parasites in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, wanting their cake and to eat it too. To Masculists, this profound hypocrisy makes fluffy feminists seem misandrist bigots. As the Masculists succeed in transmitting their Masculist ideas to their cultures, particularly the idea that the essence of Masculism is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, telling women that now that men have given them the contraceptive pill, household gadgets, higher education, modern medicine, a life expectancy well into the 80s, women have thus a career window of some half a century, so that even those women who have 2 kids and take some time off to raise them as infants and toddlers have a strong moral obligation to FIP up, become FIPs, financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college so that they can be FIPs as adults and not parasite off the labour and money of a man. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, seeing them as immoral, parasitic, man-slaving vermin to be wiped out. Masculists hate fluffies the way the abolitionists in the US in the 1800s hated the slavers of Negroes in the southern states of the US before the US Civil War. As Masculist ideas spread throughout Western countries, more and more women will become exposed to Masculist ideas, especially when the Masculists capture the attention of the broadcast journalists, with the biggest story of the century, that is, the paternity rejection of the MGTOWs, men going their own way, who refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves due to the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated fluffy feminists who abuse divorcing fathers badly by robbing them, treating them as sexploitable cash machines. As millions of women become exposed to Masculist ideas, they will become familiar with the logic of the Masculists, and a lot of them will become sympathetic to the goals of the Masculists and will support them, for example, with the Masculist push for the fipping of women, the creation of a FIP society, where both sexes are socialised and educated to be FIPs, so that girls are taught by parents and teachers to FIP up, or be punished by men by being totally ignored by men, forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and increasingly spat at, as society becomes more masculist conscious, more aware of how women oppress men, especially seeing women as man-slavers. The Masculists are telling women that if they want to have babies, they will have to vote with men to men-fair the gender laws. Otherwise, the MGTOW men will continue to boycott paternity, thus wiping out whole populations. In today's Western world, 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. If things don't change in the world of gender politics, especially in the divorce courts, and the paternity rejection right is not legislated, then probably within a decade, 90% of young men will have gone MGTOW in practice, if not in philosophy, which would be a catastrophe, because it means that our populations get wiped out in a mere generation. So men, especially MGTOW men, have the power to force women to FIP up and vote with men to force the gender politicians to men-fair the gender laws by reforming the divorce laws so that they are fair to both sexes, which is far from being the case today. The massive gender injustice committed against men in the divorce courts screams out for reform. One father in 4 gets financially massacred and has his life ruined in the hated, fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce courts. He'll be stripped of his kids with 90%, so that the MGTOWs argue, why have kids at all? That was in brackets, so open brackets. So that the MGTOWs argue, why have kids at all, when the odds are so high of losing them, close bracket. He will lose half his possessions to his fluffy ex-wife. He'll be forced to give his house to her so that she can raise her kids in it. He will pay child support to his kids, whom he will barely see. If his wife is a real fluffie and the divorce court judge is a real monoconscious feminazi who has traditional monoconscious expectations of men, seeing men as sexploitable cash machines for women, then the divorcing father may have to pay alimony to his fluffy ex-wife for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligations on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fit up, so that she ceases to parasite off him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Many feminists who are not dyed-in-the-wool feminazis, open brackets, who behave as misandrous, male-dumping feminazi bitches, the most hated category of women by the Masculists, close brackets, will be sympathetic to the gender plight of divorcing fathers in the divorce courts and be motivated to support men, that is, the Masculists, in favour of reform in the divorce courts, bringing in the para, and for giving men equal rights across the board, removing legal and cultural discriminations against men. Masculists are preaching to moderate feminists that it is in the self-interest of such feminists to become biconscious, because there are rewards for such women. They will be more likely to have boyfriends, since a biconscious feminist is much less likely to be feminazi bitchy, that is, angry at men for the ways men oppress women, as feminism teaches her, because she will also have had her masculist consciousness raised by exposing herself to masculist ideas. She will learn how women oppress men, and agree to some extent to the masculist claim that women's oppression of men is far stronger, far deeper, far more sustained, lasting decades than women's oppression of men, since fluffies parasite off men for decades by not bothering to fip up, and then expecting to parasite off the money and labour of men, making them so hated by the masculists that masculists aim to kill them by wiping them out, by totally ignoring them, so that their fluffy bitch genes are removed from the gene pool, by being unable to have babies because no quality man will give them his sperm. Such hated, misandrous, monoconscious, fluffy feminazis are forced to rot on the shelf to extinction, wiping them out. We men have the power to do that, since we men have a monopoly over the supply of sperm. Biconscious feminists, however, usually lose their gender bias, their anger bias, because the feminist anger they feel against men, due to the oppression of women by men, is more or less cancelled by the masculine anger they feel towards fluffies and fluffy feminist hypocrites, due to the oppression of men by women. These two gender angers are in opposite directions and cancel each other. Hence, biconscious feminists are much less feminazi bitchy, and hence are a lot more approachable by men. So such women are much more likely to have boyfriends, to be regularly penised, given regular orgasms, and more importantly, babies. So are much happier in life, in contrast with the monoconscious feminazi type feminists, who are the first category of female to be totally ignored by men, who have a real hatred for these misandrous, male-dumping feminazi bitches. Now, fast forward some years into the future and imagine what impact the rise and rise of biconscious feminists will have on the monoconscious feminists. The biconscious feminists will tell the monoconscious feminists that they are fools, bigots, ignorant and insensitive to the gender plight of men, and that they, that is the monoconscious feminists, deserve their fate, that is, to be manless, loveless, sexless, babyless and despised, not only by men but increasingly by women, especially young women. The Masculists are telling young women to vote with men, to men-fair the gender laws or be punished by men, MGTOW style, by quality young men refusing to give young women their sperm, forcing these young women to be babyless, which will drive them crazy. The Masculists are telling young women to hate the monoconscious feminazis as much as men do, as Masculists do, but for different reasons. Young women want babies in their 30s or younger, but won't be able to because the root cause of their babylessness is their inability to persuade quality young men to give them their sperm, due to the toxicity of the divorce courts as taken over by the hated, fluffy, feminist hypocrites. Quality young men will continue to deny young women their sperm until the gender laws are men-faired, and that is not going to happen until young women vote with men to men-fair the gender laws, forcing the gender politicians to legislate men-fair gender laws when 60% of the voters, men and women, want this. As most women, in time, become biconscious, thanks to hefty exposure of men's issues in the broadcast media, as journalists latch onto the critical importance of the paternity rejection by masculist and MGTOW conscious males, and flood the media with masculist ideas, then a powerful moral pressure will grow not only from the masculists, but also from women, that women's inability to have babies is due, as its root cause, to the deep misandry of the fluffy feminist hypocrites in the divorce courts, and the massive gender injustice legislated by the hated gender politicians who created these misandrous gender laws in the first place. It's likely that the biconscious feminists will split from the monoconscious feminists, and real acrimony will grow between them. The biconscious feminists will accuse, just as will the masculists, that the monoconscious feminazis are indirect genociders, because it is they who are indirectly wiping out whole populations, causing young women to remain babyless due to the quality young men's rejection of paternity, because few young quality men will accept the massive odds against them of 1 chance in 4 of being financially massacred in the divorce courts if they become fathers. As masculist ideas spread throughout Western countries, probably over 90% of men will choose to reject paternity for the reasons given above. This increased rejection rate will only heighten the crisis of paternity rejection in the minds of the general public, and certainly in the minds of the politicians, who will be pulling their hair out at the prospect of their populations wiping themselves out, due indirectly to the deeply misandrous attitudes of the hated fluffy feminists, the feminazis, the monoconscious feminists. Thus the moral pressure against the monoconscious feminists will become enormous from all sides, from the media, from men, from the masculists, from women, from the biconscious feminists, and in time from the gender politicians. The masculists and biconscious feminists will be haranguing the monoconscious feminists that they are bigots, ignorant of masculist ideas, callous towards the plight of both men and towards babyless women, who increasingly will hate these monoconscious feminazis with a passion as their biological clocks tick away in their 30s until they stop. And then millions of women realize that they are never going to have a baby. When that happens, the hatred against the monoconscious feminazis will be extreme, coming from the babyless young women, well, not so young women. From the masculist, futurist perspective, men only need to continue their MGTOW style paternity rejection to cause the above hatred of the babyless young women against the monoconscious feminazis. The hatred of women alone against these monoconscious feminazis will be sufficient to cause monoconscious feminism to die out. But since men too, TOO, will be applying enormous moral pressure against these monoconscious bigots, monoconscious feminism will surely evaporate. Women are herd animals. 1,000,000 years ago, if a woman could not attract the attention of a man to give her and her babies scarce male-hunted meat, she risked starvation. So women evolved a same-sex solidarity, helping each other. A manless woman often survived then because her same-sex friends gave her some of their meat, so that the manless woman had some protein for herself and her babies. Thus, women care more about what other women think of them than men care about how men think of men. As proof of this, look at the fashion industry. Women definitely have a stronger herd instinct, following what other women think than men do. So, in time, as more and more women become biconscious, a tipping point will be reached, and monoconscious feminists will be swayed by the female crowd, seeing that the monoconscious tide is turning in favour of biconscious feminism, and that will influence them a lot. Once the tipping point is reached, women will quickly switch from monoconscious feminism to biconscious feminism, because it will be too psychologically difficult for them to remain in the ever-diminishing monoconscious feminist camp, with society, men, women, the media, all labelling such monoconscious feminazis as monoconscious bigots to be spat at, who are responsible indirectly for the wiping out of whole populations, to be truly hated. This is very much in Masculist. Thus, it is very much in Masculist interest to foster the hatred of the monoconscious feminists by biconscious feminists and by women in general. Masculists thus need to push their ideas not only to men but to women, to socially engineer large numbers of biconscious women who will then influence the monoconscious feminazis more than men can due to the same-sex preference of women. Increasingly, the word feminist will be associated with the word bigot, that is, monoconscious feminazi bigot, indirect genocider, as ignorant, callous, a fool who through her own stubbornness and ignorance does not bother to become biconscious and thus suffers the fate of being manless, childless and spat at from nearly all groups of society. Monoconscious feminazis are doomed to die out. Thank God! Exclamation mark. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Brackets contains links to 300 plus YouTube, Minds, BitChute, Masculist essays/videos. Close brackets. And to the book, Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women. An e-textbook of 300 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Ciao.